Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. I'm shooting this on Friday afternoon, so there should be enough time for everybody to get their questions in, but let's jump in and see what we got. First up, over on Floatplane, Ibangan says, I'm getting ready to start replacing the caps in all my consoles, 27 in total. Whew. And I'm all sorts of new to this. I plan on ordering cap kits from Console 5. If I lose a cap or more likely destroy a cap in the process, can I replace a lower voltage cap with a higher voltage one? Yes, absolutely. I'll finish the rest of your question in a moment, but for some insane reason, there's still a debate about this, but as long as the capacitance is the same and it will physically fit in the same area, if you had originally a 10 volt cap, you could put a 20 volt, a 2 million volt. It's higher for the voltage side is totally fine. You just can't change the capacitance. But going back to your question, from what I understand, in some equipment this is okay, and in other equipment it isn't. How would this affect retro consoles? I ask because I live close to a decently stocked electrical supply, but they don't always have everything. But in a pinch, it would be easier to take a 15-minute drive than order a capacitor online. So I actually don't know of situations other than replacing a different type of capacitor. And while I'm absolutely not, the ultimate expert in this, I have some friends that are experts, and I've bothered them with this a million times over the years. So there's absolutely a scenario in which there are different types of caps. Like if you open up a 32X, there's a weird one up on top that's just by looking at it, you could tell it's not a standard capacitor. So even if the ratings were the same, that wouldn't really work. You would need the same type. And of course, size. But other than that, I really just think I don't know of any case where going with a higher voltage cap would ever be a problem. Or at the very least, maybe that's a true statement in retro gaming, but I can't really think of it in any other scenario. The only other thing to suggest, start with like a Super Nintendo, because it's way easier to get to those caps than a lot of other consoles, and there's way less of them. And if there's any leaking capacitors, so it's usually pretty noticeable. And you also want to check for like how bad is it leaking? Is it just a little bit of gunk? Is there some corrosion? But I would also tackle those right away. And if there's a lot of corrosion already, I would send it to a pro, because it's very easy to mess this up if you haven't done it. I'm not trying to insult you by saying send it to a pro and not do it yourself. I'm just being very honest in that I can't tell you how many times I've approached a project that was well within my skill level, and I got to something that was right on the line, messed it up, and then the repair ended up being more of a pain than if I just brought it to someplace in the first place. It ended up taking more time and would have cost me more than if I just said, hey, could you recap this? So I'm all for doing your own stuff. I just want to make sure everybody knows, when you get to that point where you're like, ooh, I don't know if I'm good enough for this yet, either hold off or just kind of pass that along to the pros that do this all the time. Over on the YouTube subscription page, Retron said, since the Haas is out of stock for the foreseeable future, what other options are available to play JAMA games at home? Is a full-size cabinet a legit option? So the Haas is a super gun that's known as one of the best, if not the best, and with it out of stock, yeah, full-size cabinets are great. Just make sure they're actually JAMA, and understand that that's another long list of things that could go wrong. Your chassis could need recapping. You're going to need to make sure everything lines up correctly. Certain games aren't going to be centered the same as others, so you might want to, depending on which cab you use, if the controls are easily available, cool. If they were buried like they were in my Mortal Kombat machine, you might want to get one of those horizontal and vertical adjustment adapters like I talked about on the podcast last week. But I love those. There's also the minigun, which is a great choice, and it's open source. So I believe there's a few people selling those. So if you wanted to use it on like an RGB monitor on a normal gaming setup, I would look into that. There's going to be at least one more coming out this year from the perspective of as cheap as possible. The Haas has you covered with every feature you could want, or most at least. But this other one is going to be the opposite of that. Hey, what's the cheapest way I can safely get my arcade boards on my home RGB setup? But it's my personal preference, just, my subjective opinion here, that I would always prefer a full-size cab, either stand-up or a sit-down candy cab. It's about the experience at that point, And I do really enjoy that. It just feels a little bit different. That's kind of what the live stream with Jimmy last week was about as well, is some games, to me, just feel better when you're on an arcade machine. It just, maybe that is nostalgia kicking in, which for me, nostalgia is only a very small part of it. You know, once you get a few minutes into a game, nostalgia is useless. Either the game stinks and you're, and you're bored, or you're having fun and you like the game. So maybe that is part of it. Maybe sitting or standing at an arcade machine does kind of give that sense of, oh, this, I remember when I was a kid and did this, but it is my preference. So if you have the room for a full-size arcade machine and the ability to move one, which is often it's the hardest part, I would definitely look into that. And there's going to be some more equipment for arcade machines that should make swapping boards in and out like this easier, as well as maybe even some streaming options soon. But both are great options. You know, the Haas, the minigun, the new one that's coming out, and any kind of real arcade machines. I would just pick whatever is the best for your situation overall. Now moving over to Patreon, the GOAT wants to know how to get the 240p test suite to load through the X-Station on the PlayStation. It hangs in the X-Station menu and never loads. A quick Google search shows other people with the same problem, but the solution somebody found is a broken link. So it's odd that you're mentioning this now, because I just yesterday was using the 240p test suite on my X-Station on a PS1 digital installed system and setup. And I don't remember where I got it from. I would assume that I got it from the GitHub link, as I do all the other 240p test suite versions. But it could have been a scenario in which I was deep into testing the X-Station for the video and just, went into some Discord somewhere and went, hey, somebody help, I need this to work for the video. But in all honesty, if this is a problem that you and other people are running into, I would bring that to the attention of the 240p test suite team, because the X-Station is kind of becoming the de facto standard for optical drive emulation on the PlayStation. So I think they would want to know, because most of us nerds are probably going to want to load the 240p suite on there. So maybe they'll post another version if it's not a problem. So if it's not a fix per se, but it's a difference, maybe they would post a different version for ODEs, or maybe even an IPS patch that would allow that to happen. And of course, if you need it in the short term, you might be able to burn it to a disk and then rip that in a format that the X-Station would be able to understand. But overall, I think this is something that that should go directly through the team that works on it, because I think that they would want it to be a global fix for everybody. So sorry I didn't have any better information, but I think that's probably the best answer. Gold Saturn wants to know if I have any right angle RCA couplers that I'd recommend. They just got the open source SCART coupler, but there's not enough room for their monoprice cables with the metal connectors to plug in next to the coupler and turn horizontally without pressing against the G-SCART switch. They'd be interested if there's an option that won't negatively affect signal quality, and bonus points if it's a 3-in-1 so all 3 video wires can just plug in. Or should they just buy another component and audio cable with smaller plugs? They have this set of monoprice cables, which looks pretty, they look good. I mean, they look shielded. Without opening them, you really wouldn't be able to tell. They look good, but, the one thing about the HD RetroVisions is just the consistency and quality. They were designed for gaming. They're excellent quality. So my first suggestion would be to just look at those. And if you think, based on the pictures online, that you could fit those without any coupler at all, that would be better, because you never know the quality of the coupler, and you'd be supporting the retro gaming scene, buying cables that are thoroughly tested and might fit. But for the moment, let's just assume they don't fit. I don't really have any suggestions, and I haven't had great luck with RCA couplers, either plug or receptacle style. So, and if anybody out there knows of any that they can absolutely vouch for, please let me know. The only ones, let's see if I still have them here. Yeah. These are the plug-to-plug style that I've been using that don't really work well. Sometimes they're perfect, and sometimes I just can't get a signal. So I don't know of any good brands, but I would love to know of ones if anybody has any good suggestions. MJF309 said they're having a major issue with their Ultra HDMI. They attempted to upgrade the firmware via an EverDrive, and the process failed. They left the unit on, hoping that it would recover, but after an hour, no luck, it's bricked. Do you know of anyone I could contact to get it resolved? They attempted to reach out to Retroactive, but never got a response. Well, the Marshal of Retroactive has a very long history of never responding to anybody ever. So while it stinks, I wouldn't expect a response. But in Marshall's defense, he did always say, he's not going to be the end user support. The installers are. And anytime you're able to buy it direct, you're supposed to go to the installers for support. So while I have no problem teasing him for his lack of email response ever, that actually is part of his terms that he doesn't do end user support. Now, I've never had this happen on an Ultra HDMI, but I think you would be able to use an external programmer to flash it. You would just really need to talk to somebody who's done it before on the Ultra HDMI. So you could probably go to the forums and see people doing the group buys. You could check for previous sellers and see if anybody's run into this issue before, and they might actually be able to just have you send them your board, not the full install, just pop out the Ultra HDMI board itself, flash it, and then send it back to you. So sorry that you went through that. It's not common, so at least that I know about. So it's not like this is an issue that's going rampant. I think you may have just gotten unlucky with that. Really sorry to hear it. Also, welcome. Thank you for supporting, and thank you very much for all the kind words. I really appreciate it. Jonathan Thomason said they just got a new Panasonic 4K TV and was dismayed to see that it has an undefeatable 16:9 stretching on any standard definition HDMI or component input while game mode is on. This means that plugging their GameCube in through HDMI from a Carby results in either a stretched low-lag image or a correctly scaled 4:3 image with quite a bit of lag not in game mode. I was wondering if there exists any low-lag HDMI to HDMI scalers which could take an SD image and output it in 1080p or 4K with proper scaling. So there's a couple of different answers. To directly answer your question, yes, the DVDO VP50s work pretty well. There's other devices that are able to do that. You can get an M Classic or an M Cable, which I believe one of the two has a 16:9 switch. I don't really love those though, but they do improve some GameCube games, not all. I really have only seen good improvements with 720p games, but that's preference. Some people love them and they don't add any lag. But that is really strange, though. I do want to back up for a minute and say that I have seen this issue on monitors. And in fact, I have two PC monitors that I bought just because they were dirt cheap, that you cannot change the aspect ratio, period. It always stretches anything, anything 480p. And depending on on the signal, as if I'm using an OSSC, it might even just not have anything at all that displayed in the correct aspect ratio, but I've never seen that on a TV before. I have seen the function buried. I have seen things where you would have to not only turn on game mode, but maybe do something like enable PC mode or rename the input to PC or something like that. So while you could get another scaler that would take care of that for you, I would really dig deep, even try contacting the manufacturer, which is hit or miss, but there might be something that you could do. And of course, there could be a setting in the Carby, maybe try DVI mode or HDMI mode. You might then actually need to run a separate audio cable, but maybe just getting an HDMI breakout device would help. And in fact, you never know. Maybe if you were planning on doing that anyway, maybe having an HDMI audio breakout device could change the signal slightly enough. That's one of those things where I wouldn't bet on it, but if you were at that point anyway, think about it. But there might be something else that you could do. So I would just mess with every setting in the Carby, every setting in your TV, and kind of look for that. Somebody else mentioned another solution, which is interesting, and it might work in that rather than try to set everything back to 4:3, try to 16:9 patch any GameCube game through Swiss. Sometimes that actually works really well, but not all the time, and that wouldn't solve your issue for any other 480p source as well. So that's weird. Please let me know if you found a fix for that, because that's just strange and to hear about a TV, and I don't think that I've seen that happen before. So please keep me updated because I'm pretty interested, but hopefully you'll find some kind of setting to change that would fix that for you. Oliver Clare looks like they're having some trouble installing wall mounts into G-Comp and G-SCART switches and is possibly looking for a modder to help finish off these installations. And to be honest, I don't really remember exactly what the installation process was. I remember with the bumpers, all I had to do was disassemble the G-SCART switch and the G-Comp, slide the bumpers over, and then, but that was a little tough because it was a bit of a snug fit, so I had to kind of press down, and I had to press in the exact right places. Otherwise, of course, you might bend or break the PCB module. And then I was able to get it all together, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But I can't remember the last time I installed a wall mount for it. I think I ended up planning on wall mounting mine, then never did, and then ended up giving my Switch to a friend that needed it and ordering a new one when they were back in stock or something like that. So unfortunately, I think I'm kind of useless to you this week because I just don't remember how that's done. But maybe anybody, any modder that's local to you or has worked on other consoles of you would be able to help, because I do understand the concern, right? If you have to push and bolt all of this stuff together, what if you do it in the wrong angle? What if you crack the PCB? It's really easy to get used to doing this stuff and take little things like that for granted. Kind of like, totally off topic, but the same in that in the back of my mind, every time I'm soldering and I see the smoke come up, I always just exhale as I get close to the PCB to blow the smoke away from me. And that's not something that a beginner would know. It's just something I've always done. And it's the same thing with assembling stuff like this. You see somebody do it in a video and it looks so easy, but so much of the stuff that they're doing is like, all right, make sure to put my finger under here to put pressure while I'm pushing on this. And they don't even explain it in the video because it's just not something they think about anymore. So I do understand. I just don't even remember how to do it. I guess I would just kind of talk to a local modder about that or something. Sorry. Rick Lewis says they've learned from me that taking apart a CRT can be very unsafe. True. The front input jacks on theirs are getting loose, and they need to wiggle the composite cables to get the picture to stay. Is this something they could take apart the TV and solder to tighten up? Or do you recommend never playing around in any CRT unless you're a professional? It's not anything with the tube, so I don't know if it's still something to avoid. They realize this isn't a great question to ask, but I'm just wondering if the whole CRT could be unsafe or just discharging that one point. No, I disagree. I think this is a great question to ask. And there's going to be a couple of different answers to you. So first and foremost, if any part of a CRT can be taken apart without going near the rear neckboard or anything like that, then it should be fairly safe. And there are plenty of the ones that I've seen where you could take the front, like the front bezel part off without even touching the back of it to get to things like controls or front jacks. And as long as you unplug it, just because, unplug all electronic devices before working on them, the stuff that you're going to be touching is not near high voltage. It's in the front of the TV. It's connected to, low powered DC boards and stuff like that, for the most part, at least. So it would be a lot safer than opening up the back and doing it. However, if you have to take the back off in order to take the front off, so you're essentially exposing the entire CRT to get to the front, it's still the same damage of if you bump into that anode cup, you could zap yourself, and that could be anything from ow, that hurt to a trip to the hospital or worse. So that's really where the warnings start to come in. But the other side of that is, it depends what kind of RCA jack you're talking about, because you could get it all undone and it could be a jack that's just sitting on a PCB somewhere. So you would actually have to desolder that and replace it with another one just like it. Or, depending on your setup and depending on how you have it done, go about that a slightly different way, but still from the perspective of removing that connector and replacing it with something else. So another option might be to just get one of those thick monster cable like things and just kind of have it hanging there always and plug your consoles into the existing cable. I would just kind of take a look at the whole situation and see what's the best option overall. And if popping the front board off is possible without opening up the back, be careful, but it should be fairly safe to do. But if you have to disassemble the entire thing to get to it, which I have seen CRTs like that before, then I don't know. I would just try to find any other creative solution around it. Unless it's like your favorite CRT, like it's an amazing 32-inch that you've had forever and it's in perfect condition. And in that case, maybe talk to a local modder and work on at the very least getting it discharged, but maybe even having somebody replace the capacitors or look into properly replacing that front composite video jack or something like that. It's really up to you how far you want to go with this, but the quick answer to your question is if you can get to the front ports without disassembling anything in back, then it should be safe to work on. MTTMCC wants to know if I have any suggestions for low latency wireless controllers for original PlayStation 1 hardware. I'm sorry, I've never actually used a wireless PlayStation 1 controller before. Because most of what I do with video games involves testing, I always try to use original OEM wired controllers on absolutely everything, just to reduce the amount of steps of troubleshooting if I start to run into a weird issue. So, I have used wireless PS3 controllers while playing PlayStation 1 on a PS3, but that's about it. So I'm really sorry I don't have any suggestions for you whatsoever, but maybe people in the comments would. You mentioned Brook adapters and Logitech adapters, and yeah, they're kind of ugly, but Brook does have a good reputation for making good stuff. So I would poll the crowd here and say, what are people using for wireless PlayStation 1 controllers? And of course, there's always just getting an extension cable, which is not at all what you asked. You wanted low latency wireless, but if you need a solution and you just want something to hold you off, you could always just get yourself a controller extension cable for now while you're looking for wireless. So, thanks very much. You said long time lurker, first time caller type of thing. Sorry that your first question I don't have a good answer to, but thanks for the kind words and your support, and hopefully the next question I could get for you. Watermelon Bonsai wanted to follow up from last week and had a question. I guess the follow-up was they purchased a cheap $20 component to HDMI converter and ran it through its paces, and it actually worked. So really glad that was a cheap solution for you, or cheap compared to other options. But your actual question, you were delighted to see me review the SCART Picture Adjust box from Time Harvest, as they purchased one on AliExpress a few weeks ago, although it would probably be months before I actually receive it. The picture on their Sony PVM 2030 has always been slightly to the left, so I was hoping to get such a device to help alleviate that, as I too am afraid to open it up and recalibrate it myself. So I'm glad you reviewed it, and I'm also glad that it doesn't seem to cause any voltage issues. Although I was curious, do you know what kind of power adapter I should use? I don't believe it comes with one. They say 9 to 12 volts without polarity requirements, but I'm not exactly sure what that means. What did I use or recommend? The person who lent it to me sent me theirs, and I got lazy and just used that one. But as long as the barrel fits, I would just use anything. I would grab a 9-volt power supply from a console, one of the triads, whatever else, and just kind of use that. If it has polarity protection, and most things do accept a wide variety of voltages, even if they don't advertise it, most components like that at least. So I would just plug something in and give it a try. Too bad that they don't include power supplies with it, though. It shouldn't be hard for them to include international power supplies for just a few dollars more. Also, I didn't mention in the review, but they were curious if I can give my impressions on it in terms of how well it actually adjusts the picture. It worked great. If you go too far to one side, your monitor starts freaking out, so just keep that in mind. It's not broken if that happens. It would happen with any picture adjust box. And the other question, if I had to readjust it every time or if it stayed in the same spot between adjustments. So for the same console, like if I powered everything off and powered everything back on, everything's exactly where I left it. But I didn't really go one console after the other. So you might have to keep messing with it, but it's very easy with the controls right out there. The only thing I would suggest, though, and something that I don't want to push too hard on, but I did notice in your question, is you said that your Sony PVM 2030 has always been slightly to the left. If that's the case, if everything you put on it is too much to the left, you should be able to go into settings without opening the PVM at all. I could be wrong about this. It could be a service menu that's not available in your model, and it was on mine, which is why I'm remembering it this way. But unless you've already done the research, I would take a moment to just do some Googling and figure out if there's any way to change the horizontal position without opening up the monitor at all, or if you do have to open it up, is it one of those things where the controls are right there, or is it buried so you have to go near the tube and you don't want to do that? I would just kind of take a moment to check that. And the last thing, did the picture quality suffer at all? I assume there was no added lag. So I did lag test a different, actually I lag tested the JAMA version of this, and there was no lag on it. The picture quality seemed fine, but I was also using it on my test setup with kind of a crazy monitor. So there certainly wasn't anything major. I didn't plug it in and go, oh wow, look at all this interference or anything like that. But I actually didn't do any in-depth picture quality tests. It is something I would like to go back and do at some point with a solid solution that wasn't freaking out on me. But if you already purchased it, I would just give it a try. Remember that on CRTs, it's going to be a lot more forgiving than taking a signal, digitizing it, and putting it on a flat panel. So if there was a tiny bit of signal degradation, you're probably not going to notice it as much as if you were going on a flat panel. So hopefully I got all your questions covered, but please let me know if I missed one. Seth Lombardi had a question about integer scaling on both the horizontal and vertical axis on the Mister and the new features that are involved with that. I started to answer your question and then I got off on a very long tangent about scaling, so I think it's probably better to just take it a step back a moment. The new scaling options on the Mister allow for integer scaling, which is the sharpest possible scaling that you could have. You could argue that the other scaling options they have, you would not even notice the sharpness difference because they're that good. But there are those of us that just want their images prepared the way that they like. So that's why the option is available if you like it or not. Now, if you set the horizontal integer scale to a certain level as well, you very often get too wide or too narrow of an aspect ratio. For things like any 256 pixel wide images like NES, most Super Nintendo games, stuff like that, with a 1080p scale, you could actually get a perfect integer on both the horizontal and vertical axes, and it almost is 4:3 and looks phenomenal. No shimmering, sharpest pixels possible. And I do talk about that on the OSSC page. I still wonder if I should have added that to the video or not. I really was afraid it would just confuse things, but now I end up talking about it quite a bit. So please read through the OSSC page and go down towards the bottom. I know you're specifically talking about Mister, but that could put things into perspective. I have pictures and stuff like that to describe all of this. So and with the 320 wide, you usually are going to get a little too wide of an image if you stay with an integer scale. But depending on the game, that might not actually be a bad thing. For Neo Geo, it's usually fine for me. For Genesis, sometimes it's a little too wide, but then you get circles instead of ovals. I feel like every time I say that out loud, Firebrand X will appear out of nowhere and lecture me on that. Just kidding, obviously. A friend of mine. But it really comes down to what your eyes prefer more. Do you really want to see the exact aspect ratio and sacrifice a tiny little bit of sharpness? I don't think with some of the solutions Mister has that you would worry about shimmering if you just set it to a certain aspect ratio, but it could be. I usually use RGB output for my Mister except for video captures, so I don't run into that too often. But I think to understand what Mister's doing in the context of retro gaming is confusing at first only because they call it a little bit different than what some of the scalers call it, but it is the same theories behind it. So I would just kind of go through the video capture page on the website and probably start with the bottom of the OSSC page and see if you could learn about the scaling algorithms there and how, you have to do an even number of scale, how that looks in the different aspect ratios, and then kind of apply that back to the Mister. But it's interesting, and it's one of those rabbit holes that once you start learning, you realize how much more there is to learn about it, which is why the Mister team likes to default to the easiest options for everybody, which I think is right. I think that's absolutely the right way to go about doing it. So hopefully that was the better way to answer your question rather than a very long discussion on aspect ratios. But if that's something that you'd like, check out Firebrand X's channel as well, because I think he goes into that on a lot of his optimal timing settings and really sheds a lot of light on the more technical end of that. 2 questions from Elmer M. First, they have a G-Comp switch 4x1 and a G-Comp switch 8x2. Can I connect these two together to extend my inputs? Absolutely. You just want to use a good quality cable. Otherwise, it would be the same as using a bad cable in any scenario. So I suggest getting a set of the plug-to-plug RCA HD Retrovision cables and connecting them that way, and you should have no problems whatsoever. All the quality should be the same throughout all of them. Second question, is it normal to use a G-comp switch with an Extron crosspoint switcher? It's not bad, but it's not normal because depending on the setup, you would either just have a bunch of G-comps or just use an Extron crosspoint, especially because, I have been able to still find them on eBay for fairly cheap. I do understand the scenario of like, you have a G-comp 8x2, a G-SCART 8x2, and a VGA switch, and you plug all of those into a crosspoint and use that to have a matrix output to multiple, more than just two for each. That would make sense to me. But I guess the more important thing to remember is it's not harmful. So while it might not be common, so it might not be normal per se, it's not a bad thing to do. The only thing that you would ever need to worry about is if you're doing a G-SCART into the Extron crosspoint, the output of that on the sync line is probably going to be higher voltage. So you would need a cable if you're going to SCART equipment that lowers the voltage on the sync line. But you're just specifically talking about component video here, so no, you should be totally fine. I wouldn't worry about that. And while it might not be a normal solution or a typical solution, it should be totally cool to do. Oliver Clare wants to know if I've incorporated fiber optic HDMI cables into my setup at any point yet. Not yet. It's something I plan on doing if I ever move to a bigger place and need to have a longer run of HDMI. That's definitely what I'll be using. I did do a post on RetroRGB about it because there was at least one model that people had tested and found were good quality, no lag added, and were fairly long as well. And while they're expensive, they're like $200-ish. It absolutely solved the problem. So if I ever set up a basement, with a wall of video games and wanted to run it to a streaming PC, I absolutely would pick something like that. But I just don't have enough experience to give recommendations on which brand other than the one that was in that post. And I don't have any other tips just because I haven't done it myself yet. But I do know that other people are doing that and looking into it, and they seem to have pretty good luck. Adrian Freeman has a question regarding power. They have 3 12-slot power strips all daisy-chained together and plugged into a standard grounded wall outlet. Will I come home to my house in flames? Good question. So I always have basic tips about power and things that I do that maybe you don't need to do, but I'll share anyway. First, it's good that you have the standard grounded wall outlet. That's always something I recommend. Make sure the power in your house is okay. For me personally, I unplug anything that I don't use daily. And that's kind of a pain depending on your setup. But for example, where I am now, none of my monitors are left plugged in, just my main TV and computer and stuff. And the theory is that I don't want to ever have like a lightning strike happen and blow out a monitor that's rare and expensive that I wasn't using anyway. So I just feel like for the 2 seconds it takes to plug it in, I might as well leave it unplugged. When I did have a setup that I left everything plugged in where I could just press a button and keep going, I had this exact extension cord I used to use that I ran this from the power over to where I had all of my power strips. And when I was done using it, I would just press this button and it would cut the power to it. And unlike a lot of surge protectors, power strips, whatever you want to call them, this thing I believe actually does cut the power like a GCFI outlet for your kitchen and bathroom. I always get that acronym wrong. It's probably not it, but having that in the mix was definitely a help because I didn't really have to worry about that stuff, and the whole thing got shut down, whenever I was done with it. So that's just something to consider. You certainly don't need to do that. Those are just things that I like to do. The only thing that I don't recommend is doing stuff like getting those $8 Walmart power strips and plugging one into the other. I've seen people do it and it was absolutely fine and they never had a problem. But if possible, I would look into getting 1 or 2 of those really long, like office IT style power strips. So every 6 inches, there's an AC plug. And that's kind of designed for this because remember that, in most people's setups, you're not going to have everything turned on at the exact same time. So running everything through that would be completely safe. Also, I'd like to have some kind of power conditioning at the end of my really expensive stuff. My D32 has one on its wheel rack just for it. My main setup with my OLED TV has everything plugged into it. I have it linked in the Amazon page. You just have to make sure that any concurrent devices aren't drawing more power than it could handle, but I don't have that issue with my setup. I think most people wouldn't either. I think that's more for like business stuff, but that's something that would always help too. And you could turn that power off. So the same theory of my yellow cable here, but have that at the end and power that thing off directly. That's always an option. But, overall, it's basically just about trying to make sure that nothing's a fire hazard and trying to not hurt your consoles and just kind of have general safety all over. So hopefully those are decent tips. Let me know if you want any more. And thank you very much for the kind words. That really appreciated. Tyrant Rex said, just a quick question. What scaling filter in OBS do you prefer? Most of what I'm capturing that needs to be scaled is 16:9 480p coming from a Wii Dual HDMI out to an Elgato HD60S. If you have the time, a brief explanation of the 5 OBS scaling filters would be greatly appreciated. Well, no disrespect, but that's not a quick question, and there is no brief explanation. Just teasing, but the truth is I'm not an expert on the OBS scaling filters. Different ones might apply depending on your situation, and which ones to use would depend on your source content and your destination and the purpose of it. If you are using a heavily compressed stream just to talk to a buddy or something, I really wouldn't care what I did. I would just slap something together. But if you're presenting content where you want the highest quality streams possible, you're doing recording and stuff like that, then yes, I would also go through the time to do it. I could share what I am comfortable with because I do all the time, in that for 2D stuff, 2D graphics that's retro based, so you really want those sharp pixels, I use point scaling, and I only use an integer of whatever I'm sending it. So whatever resolution OBS detects it as, I either double, triple, or quadruple it. I don't ever go anything in between, or you lose some of the sharpness. Now, there are scenarios in which area might be better depending, but now we're starting to get into where I don't have an expertise. I would direct you to the R3 Wiki and the R3 Discord. I often bother the good people there for a lot of different things. But if you're talking coming from a Wii Dual HDMI out, and the content that you're playing is virtual console games from classic consoles, then yeah, I would probably suggest doing it the way that I just mentioned. But if it's 3D graphics, a different type of scaling might be a better fit. And it might not even matter if it's done in a specific way. As long as you retain the aspect ratio, you might be able to resize in a way where you could just fit it into whatever graphics you have in there or anything like that. So I guess I might have been able to get you started with the point scaling for retro, but if it's something that's important to you and you want to prepare a good quality stream or capture, I would look a little bit deeper into that, but just keep your source and your target in mind when doing things like this. Jason Guffey wanted to pose the question of where I draw the line for what I would call retro. And I think that's actually a pretty interesting discussion that might be the most fun had in a group podcast environment where a bunch of people were just bouncing ideas off each other. But I'm certainly happy to share my thoughts on my general opinion of that and how it pertains to RetroRGB especially. So the general opinion of that is just things are new and shiny and exciting, and then they're the thing that people are just used to seeing. And then something else new comes out and they kind of get pushed back. And at some point, people might have a re-interest in those. Whether it's the newest thing doesn't do what that does, even if the newer thing does it better, it's still not the same. And maybe a lot of times nostalgia might play into that. Like, but I want to have that experience again because that was the experience I had at the time. But that's kind of where things go from new to mainstream to forgotten about and old to now they're retro again. Now they're renewed. And how to call things in the gaming world, that is interesting because there's a lot of factors involved. Like in the car world, it's not just the year of the car, but it's the generation. 5 to 10 years in a row, you could have the cars sort of look the same, that same body style, and that might be full generations that have to go by before you would think of that as a retro car. So it's kind of interesting on where that would apply. In the gaming world, it's generally CRT versus flat panel. So whatever's more at home at a CRT versus what's more at home on a flat panel. But as far as the website's concerned, the focus on what I've personally done, obviously the other contributors are free to do whatever they feel like, but I've always tried to focus on the things where I feel like I could add something, and that's all of the non-HDMI consoles and their accessories and upgrades and all that stuff. And of course, there's always exceptions to that. You know, PlayStation 3 is backward compatible. There's older games on newer consoles, whether they're ports or new retro or whatever you want to call them. But the focus on the website is where I feel like I could add something, and that's all the analog consoles that are meant to be outputted onto CRTs. But that's not where it's going to stay, because even though all of these consoles now are digital and you don't need to really worry about AV mods to them, there's a lot of other things and other scenarios in which you would kind of want to learn about how to make those things work on newer equipment. And there's certainly going to be a time where, 8K TVs are the norm and 8K scalers are out, and now it's important on how exactly do you take those games from the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 and present them in this new resolution? What's the best way to scale them? What are the upgrades that could be done because of that? What have the community made for it? So while there's certainly no end to the limits of RetroRGB, at the short term at least, the focus is on anything that didn't fit with any console or accessory that's pre-HDMI era. And I think that most people in the gaming world would be comfortable with that. GameCube, PlayStation 2, and Xbox, original Xbox kind of walks that line, but I think people are comfortable calling that retro now because all of them are a really good fit on a flat panel. The only one that's still iffy, the original Xbox doesn't have an HDMI port, but it does look great on a flat panel TV. So that's still kind of up in the air, but that's kind of what I would consider retro for now. And while I certainly wouldn't consider a PlayStation 3 a modern console, it still looks amazing on even 4K flat panels. So obviously not as good as a PS5, but it's not like you would have to worry about taking an original NES with its composite and plugging it into a flat panel. Everything still works fine. So that's kind of my general thoughts on that. I wanted to keep it short-ish because it would be very easy for me to go off on a deep philosophical tangent about, what's retro and what does that mean and what's the word retro mean versus just different. And I don't know, but I'm certainly not one of those people that only likes old things. I have met a few of those people in my life. I just like whatever makes me happy, and I love electronics, and I certainly like the art and the play style of 2D side-scrolling adventure games. Those were always my favorite. And any gaming experience that you could enjoy with your friends, which I don't think that has any time limit on it whatsoever. I could play an Atari 2600 versus spinner game with somebody and have just as much fun as playing a brand new Mario Kart game, versus a friend. So that's kind of just my general thoughts on it. Hopefully that was entertaining enough, but it's certainly a good question and one that's fun to kind of talk about and discuss. Well, that's it for this time. As always, thanks to everybody who participates in these. And if for whatever reason I missed your question, please just re-ask it next week. It's never intentional. Very often I end up accidentally deleting a file in post or using the wrong file or something like that. So if I missed your question, my apologies. It's never intentional. And if you're new to these, ask any question you'd like wherever it is that you support. Just please ask in the newest Q&A post, because the way the services work is it's really hard to go back and try to filter through older posts. So just go to the latest Q&A post, ask your question there, and I will answer it on the following week's Q&As. And of course, and especially, thank you to everybody who supports, because it's what's keeping all of the work I'm a part of alive. I appreciate it so much. So thank you all, and I'll see you next week.